Here, she's like, what are you going to do? Because normally I don't do well in enclosed spaces. I need to expand, I need to walk, I need to talk, and so I feel a little bit trapped up here. Hey, I want to tell you, all of you who are sticking around, thank you very much. God bless you guys. And I guess I need to get this mic more in my face. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, normally I don't need a mic, but there's a lot of ground to carry. The first thing I want to mention, though, is, you know, I see the Oath Keepers and the militia here, and many other different groups. And a couple of different groups were mentioned up here. The guy who was speaking from a long distance, you know, through the telephone, what was he? The Liberty Restoration. You know, we've got all of these liberty groups around here. And I want to say thank you for the things that you're doing. But sometimes I want to say, though, that we tend to get into our little group and think we are the only answer. And I want to say that we are united. And that's the beauty of this Libert-Fest tonight, is really to unite all of our efforts. Because it's going to take all of our efforts to make this happen, to reestablish liberty. The liberty that we know is eking out of this country almost faster than I can talk. It takes all of us. And it's not just from one perspective or another. But I dare say, though, it does take an education. It does take to know what we are all about. And let me suggest, or maybe acknowledge, or at least say, you know, here's the deal. You know, we've heard people talk about it being a Christian, and we, you know, hear that people a lot of times call themselves Christians. But I dare say that 99.9% of the Christians that say they're Christians have never even opened up the manual that says, here's what a Christian's all about. The Bible. Because I hear Christians talk about stuff all the time that I'm like, you didn't find that in the Bible. Well, guess what? We have the same situation with Americans. 99.9% of the Americans who say they're American have no clue as to what's in our Constitution. And I am finding that even among those who have a little bit of a modicum of understanding of what is in the Constitution, that even they are not well aware of what all is in our Constitution. I'm going to ask you about a definition here. How many of you know what a bill of attainder is? Raise your hand. I see one. Nobody else? Okay. How many of you have your little pocket constitutions? If you don't have one, run over to the Constitution Party tent or wherever they've got them distributed. Grab one, because I'm going to point out something to you. All right? Article 1, Section 9. Go ahead and pull it up, folks. Article 1, Section 9. Section 9, Article 1, Section 8 is for Congress, the dues. Here's what Congress is supposed to do. Article 1, Section 9 is the ones that, here's Congress, here's things you are not supposed to do. And look, if you've got this version on page 8, the second one down there says, no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. Okay, folks, what the bill of attainder is, in the old Great Britain, it used to be that they could pass a law that Randy Stufflebeam is guilty of sedition and he's going to pay by death. The legislators could pass a law that Randy Stufflebeam is guilty of sedition and we're going to execute him at high noon. Attainder is the form of the word to taint. That means by law they could taint somebody as being a criminal. According to the Constitution, no bills of attainder shall be passed. Now, we've heard people mention the NDAA, especially the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. How many of you have ever actually read the text? Anybody? A few of you? I've read the text, and I can tell you within the text of that piece of crap for a bill, that it says that our government officials can arrest us with nothing more than saying, we think you're a terrorist. Totally violating the Constitution. It is a bill. And I suggest to you, it is a bill of attainder that taints people based upon somebody's opinion. Not based on the law. Not based on the Justice Department. It's an absolute, complete violation of our Constitution. And how many of you knew that it was in there? I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm not here to anger you. I want to challenge you to fully understand the document that makes us American. We need to understand what's in here. I would even challenge you, how many of you know who it is that's responsible, who constitutionally is responsible for appointing the officers in our Army? Who's responsible according to the Constitution? I heard one person say it, but he's heard my speech before. Article 1, Section 8. Let's take a look at it, folks. Article 1, Section 8. And in the middle of page 7, it says to exercise, this is the power of Congress, to exercise exclusive legislation, all, let's see, wait a minute. Did I read the right one? No, it's the one above, excuse me. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. The one above it. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. Even if the militia is employed by the government of the United States. And you got to understand that the militia back in the days of the Founding Father were supposed to be run by who? The states. In fact, what does the Constitution of Illinois say the definition of a militia is? Who's the members?
We all are.
Well, not all. It does qualify.
All
able-bodied persons in this state are members of the militia. All right? So, but let's just look at this a little bit further. What does the next clause say? Reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of officers. All right, folks, even those militia that are in the national, employed by our national, in our Army, they are to be appointed by the states. Does anybody know why? Oh, I thought you was going to raise your hand. The reason, folks, is because our founding fathers were absolutely petrified of a central government having the power to move the Army, the military forces against the people, against the states. They had this absolute aversion for it. So they said even if they were employed by the government of the United States, the officers are to be appointed by the states, because he who gets to make those appointments has the loyalty, right? How many of you have heard of people asking, what if you were asked to shoot against your neighbor or something like that if they were doing stuff? They've actually passed that around, folks. If they were answerable to the states, we absolutely know what that answer is. So it's important, it is absolutely important that you understand this Constitution. Not just say uphold it. I made an oath 22 and a half years, well, for 22 and a half years in the Marine Corps, I had an oath to support and defend the Constitution. But I will tell you, during that time, I had not a clue. I did not know what this Constitution is, and yet I was willing to lay my life down on it. I made an oath for it. And I didn't know what it was. It wasn't until after I got out of the Marine Corps that I discovered what the Constitution was and how both the political parties had betrayed my service to my country. And for those of you who have served, they've betrayed your service by violating this Constitution. All right, now I'm going to get to my topic. That was just my intro. Hope you all are fired up. Shall we have a word of prayer? All right. The year tyranny got its foothold in America. We have heard about, in fact, even James had mentioned a little bit about, we need to take back our government and get off the government dole. But do you know why we're on the government dole? It's because the government has a dole that they're not supposed to have. Our Constitution said that Congress was authorized to lay and collect taxes. But prior to 1913, no such thing happened with our income tax. There are three major things that happened in 1913 that allowed tyranny to get its foothold in America. The first was the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment is mostly what you would recognize as the income tax. Prior to 1913, there was no such thing as an income tax. The income tax has been even challenged to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's answer is, well, there's no new tax authorized by the 16th Amendment. What? The courts themselves were protecting our wages as being a source of income that could be taxed by the federal government prior to 1913. But once the income tax amendment was passed, there's 4 things that were violated. But before that, there's the second thing was the 17th Amendment, and the third thing was the passing of the Federal Reserve. Now, within the 16th Amendment, there's 4 principles, 4 constitutional principles that were destroyed by the 16th Amendment. The first thing it says is that they can tax our income without regard to source. Prior to 1913, our wages were not a source of income that could be taxed. In fact, it was looked at as being a trade for labor, not a source of income. But nowadays, if they decide that looking at the moon for a couple of hours a night is worth an income, or they can put a value on it, guess what? They can tax it! And it doesn't take a stretch of imagination to see that they actually are doing that. It says they can tax us without regard to apportionment. They can completely disregard apportionment. Article 1, section Front. Can't think of it, but you can look it up. It's there. And if somebody wants to challenge me, that'd be great. Go ahead, give her a challenge. But it says that they can tax us, but all taxes had to be, they could directly tax us, but they had to be apportioned. Now, I actually looked up the word apportioned. Anybody know what that means? Well, it means the fair distribution based upon, and this was the one that really was the kicker when I looked at, based upon representation. So the second thing that they have violated, according to the Constitution, was it used to be, prior to the 16th Amendment, that all taxation had to be apportioned. That apportionment was based upon representation. Now, there's 2 other additional things that are destroyed, and they're both very similar. It says they can tax us without regard to a census or an enumeration. Now, let me ask you, what's the purpose for a census or an enumeration? Anyone?
To know how many people are in each community.
Bingo. The purpose for an enumeration is to know how many people they are, so we know what the basis of representation is. Most of the time when I ask that question, it's so they know how much money to tax us. No! It's a basis of representation. Now think about this, folks. The 16th Amendment says that our federal government can tax us without regard to apportionment, which has a basis in representation. Remember that. Number 2 and 3 there with the enumeration and census, the basis of representation. Think about this for a second. Why was this country established? Why did our founding fathers come to this country? They came because of religious liberty. Why did we go to war? Why was the Revolutionary War fought?
One of them, taxation without representation.
There it is, taxation without representation. Our founding fathers so despised this concept of taxation without representation that they went to war. Do you understand that? Anybody here ever been to war? You've seen death, you've seen carnation. They went to war and they killed people over the idea that we're being taxed without representation, and I dare say we've got it in our Constitution. It's been passed. It is now part of our Constitution that they can tax us without representation. The very reason we declared independence from that god-awful country, England, right? Think about it, folks. And then, it was important to note, why was the 17th Amendment passed? Anybody know what that one is? It changed who our senators are elected by. Prior to 1913, our senators, those two that represent us in the federal government, were elected, appointed, or however they decided to by the state legislatures. Prior to 1913, we actually had state representation. People wonder why we've lost our state sovereignty. It's because we no longer have anybody representing the state. We have representatives of representing the people. But guess what? We already had congressmen. In fact, how many of you have ever heard of the Great Compromise? A lot of you heard about the Great Compromise. Well, do you know what that was all about? Was that it was all going to be a government based upon the representation of the people. Now, it was kind of a good idea. Madison came up with, all of a sudden, Rhode Island and some of these other smaller states said, oh no, we'll never be represented in this government if we don't have equal representation. And so they thought and we almost didn't have a constitution because of this one single issue. Those smaller states were ready to leave, and they're like, hey, we're just about to fail. What can we do to keep them here? And they came up with the Great Compromise, which split the House into a bicameral House. The lower house, interestingly, representing the people, not the upper house, the lower house, and the upper house representing the states. And guess where all bills of revenue are supposed to start? In the House, not the Senate. But the Senate can make proposals and decide whether they want to pass it or not. In other words, every revenue bill, every bill that comes out of the House has to pass through the basis of the states. States have the final key. It was our check against an overbearing federal government. We could call them in. We could say, hey, Senator, you will vote against that. Oh, we're not declaring war because we're not coughing up the troops. There's another connection that you need to be aware of. So they understood those powers that be. And by the way, does anybody know when the impetus for the things that happened in 1913 actually got its big dream and big get-together? I heard it. Jekyll Island. In fact, unconstitutionally correct, the very first interview I ever did was G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. That was my very first interview, and it was a week-long interview, and I'm telling you, it was a phenomenal interview. That happened. They got the plans in 1910, and they implemented it in 1913. And then, of course, at the end of the year, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Those three things, folks, you have to absolutely know were pieces of the puzzle that fit finely together. A lot of people don't understand. In fact, I get a lot of people that disagree with me. Randy, I'm glad I get to have a choice as who's going to be my senator. I don't want the Madigan and all of them to choose our senator. Let me tell you something, folks. I heard, the issue of how can we take back our country and, get rid of the corruption. Well, number one, competition is the answer. We had a competitive government. We had two representatives representing the state that did compete against the government, that said, government, you can't do that because that's a state authority thing. But we lost that when the senators no longer represent the people. We no longer have that. And what's the basis of all corruption? I heard power, but what's the basis of all power? Money. Money is a basis of all corruption and power. And in the case of having the senators actually represent the states, corruption works in our favor. Huh? Well, what's the basis of all corruption? I want the money in my own pocket. I don't want it to go to that place out there. I don't want them to have the money. I want it in my pocket. Think about this, folks. If the senators still represented us, and let's say corruption, they're all corrupt. Well, guess what? They want the money in the state pocket, not the federal government. They want it here. We would be better off. Corruption actually works in our favor. But no, they knew that the 16th Amendment would not stand if the senators actually represented the states, because the states would then see the money that used to be in the state coffers going into the federal coffers. Okay, so I discovered through all of this that our country has unlimited funding capability. Whatever they don't steal from us, they can print out of thin air. We're screwed, folks, because we've got nothing to protect us. We used to have senators to protect us from that idea. They knew if they saw the money going to the federal government, the states would say, you ain't getting it, and that 16th Amendment ain't going to stand. Folks, we need to know where the basis of where we are came from. But here's the thing. I knew we had unlimited funding capabilities, but how did they get this unlimited spending capability? Where did that? And for years I was perplexed until I read a book by Oliver DeMille called 1913. And in that book, he exposed where they had limited spending capability. In 1936, it was out of the Butler versus the U.S. case. The Supreme Court redefined the welfare clause. Prior to 1936, our courts and everybody else understood that the Article 1, Section 8, that has the welfare clause in there. In fact, Federalist Papers number 41, you can come to my website and read it for yourself. In there, Madison even talks about that everything that is defined in Article 1, Section 8, that welfare clause, is defined by the rest of Article 1, Section 8. That you cannot spend your money on anything that is not found in the dues. Raising and supporting armies, building postal roads, those kind of things are constitutionally correct. What's not correct is having an army standing for over 50, 60 years without a declaration of war. How did that happen? Well, I can tell you how that happened. It happens because our federal government has the money to keep them in place. Because they have this unlimited funding capability where they can unconstitutionally, as I say, but they made it a part of our Constitution by an unconstitutional amendment. I'll say that. An amendment that completely changed the intent of our founding fathers. They have this unlimited funding capability, and guess what? Just in the news, both Obama and Hillary Clinton have funded ISIS to fight this other organization. Folks, we've been doing that for years. Our government's been doing it for years. Don't you think? Here's the thing. How about, who was the president of Iraq? Hussein? Saddam Hussein, thank you. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, how did he become president of Iraq? Guess what? He was a U.S. supported dictator. We put him there. We funded all of his military efforts to take over Iraq through our CIA. We did that, folks. And then, oh, he's an evil dictator. He's a mean and cruel man. Yeah, we knew that. That's why we put him there, to take control. And now we got to go in there and take him out because he's an evil dictator. We put him there. We put ISIS there. We put all these crooks there. We've got this powerful force that we can spend our money on whatever's for the quote-unquote good of the United States. That's how they termed it. That's how they redefined it. The Supreme Court redefined the welfare clause to say for whatever's for the good of the United States or good for America. And they've even refined it to further where it can be for the good of the poor people or for the good of this group of people, or for that group of people. We're keeping an army unconstitutionally standing for over 60 years, 70 years now. Since 1940 was the last constitutionally declared war. And how did that war get declared, and where did the military come from? It came from the state militias, by the way, that stood up this whole thing. And it was done by state senators who were representing the states that then had to cough up the manpower and the resources to stand up this army to go to world war. Folks, you got to understand how this all came to be, because it's all well and good. We could say we're not taking any more of that money. Rick Perry tried to do that in 2008. How many of you remember that? As governor of the state of Texas, he says, we're not taking your bailout. Guess what? He did. Now, here's the thing. I concur with him. It's unconstitutional money. There's nothing that authorizes Congress whatsoever in our Constitution to do that. The only way they get this authorization is through these unconstitutional opinions of a Supreme Court run amok. But here's the thing, folks. If we ever want to take it back, there's only one way to take it back. If Rick Perry would have said, we're not taking the money, which I would have agreed with, the only way he could have stood up and said, but neither are you taking any more money from our people. That's the only way it could have happened. Because the government is taking the money from his people. He's got a responsibility to at least try to get a little bit of it back. Yeah, I agree if we could get off that, as I won't quite use the boob of the cow. Yeah, we got to wean ourselves off. Yeah, I agree with that. But guess what? They're taking our money. They are robbing us. They're stealing our money in what I consider unconstitutional measures through the 16th Amendment and the declarations of the Supreme Court. Opinions of the Supreme Court. Opinions of just a couple of people are running this country. Folks, I absolutely am 100% in an agreement with the fact that we need to get off of this government doling out. Absolutely. But we also need to take a stand and say, you're no longer going to take our income. And all these other fees, and in fact you heard Chris Ann talk about the fees for this and the fees for that. At some point in time, folks, we're going to have to understand, but here's the thing. With Brian, yeah, sorry about that, brother.
That's all right.
At least I didn't mispronounce it. So we're even. As Brian talked about the 47 goals of the communists, I actually have those 47 goals listed on my website in my blog, Unconstitutionally Correct. It's the 45 communist goals, and Cleon Skousen wrote that book, The Naked Communist. There was a congressman in Florida that actually read it into the congressional record back in 1963. Interestingly, and I'm with you, brother, they pretty well completed all of them. And number 15, anybody want to guess what? Now you can't, because I already divulged that to you. Number 15. Anybody want to guess what number 15 is of the communist goals? Okay, Timothy, you've been itching. Goal number 15 says the takeover of one or both of the political parties. And it's my suggestion that they have succeeded. Now, my only disagreement with Cleon Skousen is he points it out to be the 45 communist goals. And while that's true, and especially at the time, the fact is, it's not so much the communist goals, it's the globalist goals. The globalists. How many of you are really familiar with the Federal Reserve? How many of you know how many banks are in the Federal Reserve? There's a banking cartel, by the way, folks. How many of you know what they are? Who they are? There's 8 of them. Depending on who you consider as members of it. Out of the 8 members, only 3 of them have any U.S. interests. The Rothschilds, the Bilderbergs, the Rockefellers, all who control our Federal Reserve. Globalists. controlling the U.S. economy. Do you understand that? That a majority of the Federal Reserve are foreigners who don't give a rip about this country. They only give a rip about their interests. And they are using communists. They are using ISIS. They are using the Taliban. They are using all of these other factions across this globe to implement what they are trying to achieve: global dominance. And as long as America stands as a bright and shining star of liberty, they can't do it. The only way they can do it is to destroy us. And folks, they've got their claws in us. 1913, they dug their claws in. And if we want our country back, we've got to restore liberty through repealing the 16th Amendment, through repealing the 17th Amendment, and repealing that god-awful Federal Reserve. Get it gone.
Amen. Amen.
Folks, I do have hope for our country. It seems like it's getting to the point of being hopeless. I do have hope for this country. But we have got to take action. It's got to be action, folks. I've been talking to a lot of people, and they say, well, here's my vote. Here's my vote. Here's my vote. Folks, I need more than the vote. We need more than the vote. We need people to run. And I'm going to tell you, the communists have both parties. Why do you think? You know, I heard Jim say, hey, we need to dump every single one of them. Well, I'm going to tell you, I know some of them people personally. They went there to do the right thing. They try to do the right thing. But then they get swallowed into the machinery. They get swallowed into that force that's exerted upon them from the globalists. Those who actually control both the Republican and Democratic parties. The only way we are going to be able to take back our country, and to do so on a consistent basis, is to create what I believe is a multi-party system. The globalists have control over the two. My libertarian brothers, even my Green Party brothers, even though I'm diametrically opposed to just about every single thing they stand upon, I believe they should be there. Because then the globalists will have a whole lot harder time having that control. Imagine if we had a multi-party system and it wasn't just a Democrat or Republican that was being appointed to a Supreme Court of the United States. You can take a look back at all of these. I mean, how well did Roberts, appointed by that conservative President Bush, how well did Roberts defend our constitutional rights? One vote, Obamacare stood, and Roberts stood for Obamacare. So you tell me how well that's worked out so well. In fact, but I do want to read something from Thomas Jefferson that I think is really important here, because it talks about the power of what's happening. In fact, if you look at the Anti-Federalist Papers, which I happen to have the Anti-Federalist Papers on my website at constitutionallycorrect.org, I suggest reading through those, because quite frankly, reading through the Anti-Federalist Papers, you'd have to almost actually declare them to be the prophets of their day. Because everything that they were scared about with the passing of this Constitution has come to pass. There's one, I think it was it's like Anti-Federalist number 7, maybe 5, that says if you pass this Constitution, there will be a civil war. Guess what, folks? Yep, we had one of those. So go there, get educated. Here's what Thomas Jefferson had to say. It has long, however, been my opinion, and I have never shrunk from its expression, that the germ of dissolution of our federal government is in the Constitution of the federal judiciary. Did you catch that? The dissolution of our government will be done through the federal judiciary. An irresponsible body, working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief, until all shall be surpassed, from the states and the government of all will be consolidated into one. Do we not see that happening today? Here's a prophetic statement by Thomas Jefferson. I've got more, but the point is, folks, I believe we can take back our country, but we can't do it the way we've been doing it. We've got to do it from another standpoint. The globalists, you may say I'm a conspiracy theorist, and to that I say I do have a tinfoil hat, and it is lead-lined. There is a conspiracy. Another thing, just because they're out to get me doesn't mean I shouldn't be afraid. Okay, so here's the point. There is a conspiracy by the globalists to create a globalist country and a state, the American state, within a global community. Folks, if we don't understand these principles, yeah, let's get off the government dole. But how are we going to do that? We got to get the government from taking our money to begin with, so that we're trying to scream and scratch and claw for every little bit to get it back. We've got to accomplish these things. And there's only a couple of ways that we can do that. And one of those, folks, is to stand up and be counted. And I dare say it's not going to happen through the Republican or the Democrat parties. It's been tried. People I know of tremendous character swallowed up by the two-party duopoly. It will only, let me ask you this, how did Germany fall? How did the Nazi regime fall? How was that taken? There were people that stood up on the inside, but it was too powerful and they caved and they were killed. I believe it will only come from the outside, folks. I like what Donald Trump's doing. He's causing a lot of hate and discontent. But guess what? He's in the wrong party.
There's only two. That's it.
So far, there's only two. But I'm going to tell you that December the 15th, there's going to be an announcement. And I will leave you with that. Have a great night, folks.
Randy.